Camille Carter was 33 years old when she realized something had been quietly stolen from her for years. Not money, not time alone, but the right to choose how she lived her own life. It happened on a warm evening, at a family cookout, the kind filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the illusion of togetherness. Her sister, glowing with excitement, stood up and announced she was expecting baby number 4. The room erupted in cheers. Congratulations flying across the table like confetti. But in the middle of all that joy, no one looked at Camille to ask how she felt. No one asked if she had time, if she was tired, if she had dreams that didn't revolve around being available for everyone else. Instead, their eyes drifted toward her with quiet certainty, as if a decision had already been made, somewhere behind the scenes. Her mother smiled sweetly, clapping her hands, already talking about celebrations and planning ahead. Then, with a tone that sounded gentle but carried no real question, she said Camille would handle the children when her sister needed rest. It wasn't a request, it was a sentence. Camille felt it settle over her like a weight she had carried her entire life without naming. Her father didn't need to say anything. His silence spoke louder than words, reminding her of the unspoken rule that had shaped her existence. Don't argue, don't embarrass the family, just do what's expected. And his sister, with a laugh that cut sharper than any insult, brushed it off, as if it were obvious. Of course Camille would step in. Of course her life was flexible. Of course her time belonged to them. In that moment, Camille saw the pattern clearly for the first time. Every favor she had ever done, every time she had shown up without hesitation, had quietly built this expectation that she existed to serve the needs of others. It wasn't love anymore, it was assumption. And the most painful part was not that they needed help, but that they never considered she might have a choice. Sitting there at the table, surrounded by people who called themselves her family, Camille realized she had been cast in a role she never agreed to play. The moment Camille spoke, the entire table seemed to freeze, not because her words were loud, but because they were unfamiliar. Why me? That's not my responsibility. It was a simple sentence, but in that family it sounded like rebellion. The laughter died instantly. Her sister's smile disappeared, first replaced by something sharper, something offended. Then came the laugh, short, bitter and mocking. She brushed Camille's words aside, as if they were childish, calling it training, as though Camille's entire life had been nothing more than preparation to serve hers. That was the moment Camille understood something painful. They weren't surprised she said no, they were offended. She dared to. Her mother's face tightened behind a polite expression, the kind people use when they're trying to keep control without making a scene. Her father didn't raise his voice, didn't slam the table, didn't need to. The look he gave her carried years of expectation, of silent pressure, of disappointment, waiting to be triggered. It said, "Everything, don't embarrass us, don't make this difficult, don't break the role we assigned you." And yet for the first time in her life, Camille didn't shrink under it. She didn't explain, didn't justify, didn't argue, because deep down, she knew something had shifted. If she tried to explain, they would twist it. If she argued, they would guilt her. If she stayed, they would win. So she did something far more powerful than fighting. She stood up. She picked up her purse, grabbed the dish she had brought, and walked out. No drama, no shouting, no tears, just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't ask for permission. Behind her, she could feel their eyes burning into her back, waiting for her to turn around, to apologize, to fall back into place like she always had. But she didn't. Each step away from that table felt like crossing a line she had never been allowed to draw before. For a brief moment, doubt tried to creep in. Was she overreacting? Was she being selfish? That voice wasn't hers. It was built from years of being told her needs came last. But this time she didn't listen. She got into her car, closed the door, and for the first time, the silence felt different. It wasn't heavy. It was freeing. She thought walking away would end it, that one no would finally teach them where her life began and their expectations ended. But what Camille didn't know yet was that her family wasn't ready to lose control. And sometimes when you break a pattern, the people who benefited from it don't just resist, they escalate. If you were in Camille's place, would you have stayed silent or walked away? Comment below. I want to hear your choice. The next morning, Camille's phone rang from an unfamiliar number, and that single call shattered any illusion that the situation had ended the night before. A calm official voice introduced itself from the police department, explaining that 3 children had been left at a community center, with a note stating that Camille Carter was responsible for them. For a moment she thought she had misheard. Not asked, not called, not even texted. Left. The word echoed in her mind as she grabbed her keys and drove her thoughts circling the same impossible reality. Someone had taken children and abandoned them with her name, attached like a signature she never gave. The drive felt longer than it was, not because of traffic, but because she could feel something deeper shifting. This wasn't just pressure anymore, this was escalation. When she arrived, the scene waiting for her made everything painfully real. 2 police cars were parked near the entrance, lights off, but presence unmistakable. 3 small backpacks sat lined up on a bench like silent evidence. Her oldest niece sat stiffly, trying to look brave. Another child cried quietly into a sleeve, while the youngest rested against a staff member who looked exhausted by a situation she never signed up for either. Camille stepped forward, steady on the outside, even as anger and disbelief burned beneath the surface. The officer greeted her, politely confirmed her identity, and then handed her the note. It was written in her sister's familiar, cheerful handwriting, the kind that usually decorated birthday cards and grocery lists, but the words themselves felt cold. They claimed Camille had agreed to watch the children, that family helps family, and that they would be picked up later. Camille stared at the paper, realizing it wasn't just a lie, it was a setup. A carefully constructed assumption meant to force her into compliance. Slowly she unlocked her phone and showed the officer the messages from the night before. Her mother's words telling her she would handle the kids, her sister's mocking comment about training, and her own reply, clear and undeniable, that it was not her responsibility. In that moment, the story shifted. What had been presented as a simple family arrangement was now something else entirely. The officer's expression changed as he read. This was no longer about confusion. It was about consent that had never been given. Camille didn't raise her voice, didn't create a scene. She simply told the truth, calmly and firmly, asking that everything be documented, because she understood now that silence was what had allowed this pattern to grow. And this time she refused to let her name be used as a tool against her. Camille stood there in the community center, the note still in the officer's hand, her phone unlocked with the messages that told a completely different story. The tension in the room shifted the moment evidence entered the conversation. What had started as a situation her family assumed could be smoothed over with charm and pressure was now being observed, recorded, and evaluated by someone who didn't care about family hierarchy or emotional manipulation. Officer Briggs read the messages slowly, his eyes moving between the screen and the handwritten note. The contrast was impossible to ignore. On one side, a fabricated claim that Camille had agreed. On the other, clear, undeniable proof that she had refused. For Camille, that moment felt strangely calm. Not because the situation was easy, but because for the first time she wasn't being judged by expectations, she was being seen through facts. When her sister and her husband arrived, they didn't walk in quietly. Their voices carried before their footsteps filled with outrage and performance. Her sister clutched her stomach, crying dramatically about stress. And the baby, as if emotion could erase what had already been done. Her husband followed with a smirk, pointing at Camille like she had created the problem, accusing her of calling the police on family. But Camille didn't react the way they expected. She didn't argue, didn't defend herself emotionally. Instead, she turned to the officer and calmly asked that their statements be added to the report. That single move changed the dynamic instantly. What they intended as intimidation became documentation. When her parents entered, the atmosphere shifted again. Her father stepped forward with confidence, attempting to take control of the narrative the way he always had. He framed it as a misunderstanding, suggesting Camille was overreacting, implying that emotions, not actions, were the issue. For years, that approach had worked. But not here. Not now. Officer Briggs listened politely, then responded with quiet authority, explaining that leaving children in a public place with someone who had not agreed to supervise them was not a misunderstanding. It was a serious matter. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was also revealing. For the first time, Camille saw her family without the illusion of control. Their usual tactics, guilt pressure, rewriting the story had no power against documented truth. She looked at her nieces and nephew, reassuring them gently that none of this was their fault. Because it wasn't. They were caught in a situation created by adults who had mistaken control for care. Then she stood up, faced her sister, and set a boundary that could no longer be ignored. From that moment forward, everything would be in writing. No assumptions, no surprise drop-offs, no more using her silence as consent. And as she walked away again, Camille understood something clearly. This wasn't just about saying no anymore. It was about making that no impossible to erase. That night, Camille sat at her kitchen table, the quiet around her, no longer peaceful but heavy with realization. What had happened at the community center wasn't a one-time act. It was a glimpse into something much bigger. She opened her laptop, determined to protect herself, expecting maybe 1 or 2 forms to correct. But the deeper she looked, the more the truth unfolded, and it was worse than she imagined. Her first call was to her niece's school, a simple request to check emergency contact details. The secretary's response made her pause. Camille wasn't listed as a backup. She was listed as the primary pickup if the parents were unavailable. Not a favor, not optional. A responsibility already assigned. A cold feeling settled in her chest as she moved to the next call, then the next. The preschool confirmed she was not only approved to pick up the children but also listed as a support contact during weekdays. The pediatric clinic went even further. She was marked as an authorized caregiver for appointments. Camille stared at her phone in disbelief. She had never signed anything, never agreed, never even been told. When the documents arrived in her email, the truth became undeniable. Her name was there, written in handwriting that tried and failed to imitate hers. The signature was wrong. The curves didn't match. The confidence wasn't hers. It was a copy, not consent. But what shook her the most wasn't just the forgery, it was the intention behind it. One line in particular stood out. She had agreed to assist with ongoing childcare needs. Ongoing, that single word changed everything. This had never been about helping occasionally. This was a plan. A system being built quietly, document by document, to lock her into a role she had never accepted. Camille felt anger rise, but it wasn't chaotic anymore. It was clear, focused, undeniable. Her silence in the past had been treated as permission. Her kindness had been rewritten as obligation. And now it was being legalized without her knowledge. Her phone buzzed relentlessly as messages flooded in from her family, accusing her of overreacting, of being selfish, of failing them. But this time, Camille didn't respond. She understood something critical. Every word she sent could be twisted, but documents could not. So instead of arguing, she started collecting screenshots, voice messages, forms, evidence, because this was no longer just about family pressure, it was about identity, consent, and control. And Camille made a quiet decision that would change everything. She would not fight them emotionally anymore. She would fight them with proof. If you discovered someone was using your name without permission like this, would you confront them immediately or gather evidence? First, comment below. I want to hear your choice. By the time Camille picked up the phone to call a lawyer, she wasn't reacting anymore. She was deciding. The chaos her family created had finally crossed a line that emotions alone could not fix. She needed structure, clarity, and something her family could not twist the law. When Maya Chen answered, her voice was calm, grounded, and focused, the opposite of everything Camille had been dealing with. Camille explained everything from the community center incident to the forged documents and the escalating pressure. There was no judgment on the other end of the line, no disbelief, no minimization, just listening. And then after a pause, Maya spoke in a way that shifted the entire situation. She didn't start with comfort. She started with strategy. She told Camille not to meet her family alone, not to have conversations that weren't documented, and most importantly, not to take responsibility for any child she had not clearly agreed to care for. Those instructions may have sounded simple, but to Camille they felt like a complete rewrite of how she had been living. For years she had been taught that saying yes was kindness, that stepping in was love, that sacrifice was expected. But now she was being told something entirely different. Boundaries were protection, and protection required consistency. The next morning, Maya drafted and sent formal letters to every key person involved: her sister, her brother-in-law, and her parents. The language was polite, but it carried weight. Camille had not agreed to ongoing childcare. She had not authorized anyone to use her name. Any attempt to leave children in her care without explicit consent would be documented and reported. It wasn't emotional, it wasn't personal, it was precise, and that precision was powerful. When her family received the letters, their reaction was immediate and intense. Her phone filled with calls, messages, accusations. They said she had gone too far, that she had turned family into a legal issue, that she was breaking something sacred. But Camille understood something they didn't: family had already been turned into a system that used her. She wasn't breaking it, she was stepping out of it. For the first time, the dynamic had shifted. The same people who once spoke with certainty now sounded uncertain. The same voices that once controlled the narrative now struggled to respond to something they couldn't manipulate. Because you can argue with emotions, you can pressure someone into silence, but you cannot easily argue with documentation that draws a clear line. Camille didn't respond to the noise. She didn't defend herself. She didn't explain again. She simply stayed consistent with the boundaries she had finally made official. And in that quiet, something changed. Not just in how her family saw her, but in how she saw herself. She was no longer the person waiting to be told what to do. She was the person deciding what would no longer be done to her. Camille had hoped the letters would be enough. For a brief moment, the silence that followed felt like progress, like maybe finally her boundaries had been heard. But that quiet didn't come from respect. It came from planning. Because a few days later, just as she was preparing for an important meeting at the children's hospital where she worked, everything escalated again, this time, in a place where mistakes could have real consequences. The call from the front desk sounded hesitant, almost unsure. A man was in the lobby with 3 children, and he was insisting they belonged to Camille. The words didn't even make sense at first. But deep down, she already knew who it was. When she walked into the lobby, still in her work clothes, badge clipped neatly to her blazer, she saw him immediately. Trevor stood there like he owned the space, surrounded by the children, as if the hospital was just another stage for his performance. One child looked tired, another embarrassed, the youngest clinging to a toy that dragged across the floor. And Trevor, he was smiling. Not the kind of smile that comes from relief, but the kind that comes from control. He greeted her loudly, drawing attention from everyone nearby, framing her as the problem before she even spoke. He spoke about family, about responsibility, about how she had time for everything except her own blood. It wasn't a conversation. It was a performance designed to corner her. And then she noticed something else. His phone was already raised, recording. That was the moment everything became clear. This wasn't just pressure. It was strategy. He wasn't trying to resolve anything, he was trying to create a narrative, one where she would look cold, selfish, ungrateful. A narrative he could share, twist, and use against her. But what Trevor didn't understand was where he was standing. A hospital is not a private space. It is a place built on procedures, accountability, and documentation. Cameras were everywhere. Staff were trained to observe, report, and protect. And Camille knew that better than anyone. She didn't argue. She didn't react emotionally. She simply turned to security and stated the truth clearly. These were not her children. She had not agreed to take responsibility, and legal notice had already been given. Her voice was calm, but it carried authority. Within moments, her supervisor arrived, followed by additional staff. The situation shifted quickly. What Trevor thought would be public pressure became a recorded incident. His words, his actions, his attempt to leave children in a professional setting, it was all being documented. When he tried to defend himself, to charm, to redirect the narrative, it didn't work. Because in that environment, facts mattered more than performance. Security stepped in. Instructions were given. And for the first time, Trevor's confidence cracked. As he was escorted out with the children, his voice grew louder but weaker at the same time. Camille watched it all without moving, without chasing, without fixing. Because she understood something now, love didn't mean stepping in to clean up chaos others created. And as the doors closed behind him, she realized this wasn't just escalation. This was exposure. After the hospital incident, Camille didn't feel shaken. She felt certain. For the first time, everything her family had tried to hide was no longer just her word against theirs. It was recorded, documented, and impossible to ignore. When she called Maya, her voice was steady, almost calm, as she explained what had just happened. There was a brief pause on the other end, then a quiet exhale. Not worry, recognition. Maya understood immediately what this meant. The situation had crossed from manipulation into clear, provable behavior. And that changed everything. Within hours, a second legal notice was prepared and sent. This one was stronger, sharper, and far less forgiving. It restricted direct contact, prohibited any attempts to appear at Camille's home or workplace, and made it clear that using her name, image, or identity in any public or private claim about childcare would carry consequences. It wasn't emotional language. It didn't need to be. Because at this point, the pattern spoke for itself. Camille didn't need to argue anymore. The evidence was doing it for her. But while the legal process moved forward with precision, her family reacted with chaos. Calls came from blocked numbers. Messages shifted from anger to guilt to accusation, each one trying a different angle to pull her back into the same role. Her mother claimed she had gone too far, that she was tearing the family apart. Her father framed it as betrayal, saying she had exposed private matters to outsiders. And her sister, she took a different path. Instead of confronting Camille directly, she turned to something more public. A carefully crafted post appeared online, emotional but vague, showing only tears and vulnerability. She spoke about being abandoned, about the pain of not being supported during pregnancy, about how some people choose pride over family. Camille's name wasn't mentioned, but it didn't have to be. The message was clear enough for anyone who knew them. Comments flooded in sympathy, judgment, assumptions. People who didn't know the truth quickly filled in the gaps with their own narratives. And then Trevor followed with his own version. A video from the hospital, edited and shortened, posted with a caption about family and responsibility. But what he thought was proof was incomplete, because what he didn't include was just as important as what he showed. The context, the refusal, the legal notice, the security response, all missing. Camille watched it all from a distance, not reacting, not correcting, not yet, because she understood something critical. When people choose a public stage, timing matters more than volume. Reacting too quickly would place her back into defense. Waiting would allow the truth to build weight. And so she stayed quiet, gathering everything, every message, every post, every video, not to fight emotionally, but to respond with clarity when it mattered most. Because this was no longer about stopping the chaos. It was about revealing it. By the time the church fundraiser took place, Camille wasn't nervous. She was ready. The event had been planned carefully by her family, wrapped in soft colors, warm smiles, and a message about community support. To everyone else, it looked like kindness. To Camille, it looked like a stage built on a story that wasn't true. She stood at the back of the room for a moment, watching everything unfold. Her sister sat at the center, surrounded by attention, playing the role of a struggling mother in need of help. Her parents moved through the crowd, greeting people, accepting sympathy, reinforcing a version of reality that placed Camille as the one who had failed. And people believed it, because it sounded familiar, because it was emotional, because no one had seen the full picture. When the pastor stepped forward and began speaking about sacrifice and family, Camille knew this was the moment. Not to argue, not to accuse, but to correct. She walked forward slowly, her steps steady, her expression calm. Conversations faded as people noticed her. Her presence alone shifted the room. Her mother saw her first panic flashing across her face before she could hide it. Her sister's smile tightened. Trevor stepped forward, already preparing to stop her. But Camille didn't raise her voice. She didn't fight for control. She simply asked for 2 minutes. And surprisingly, she was given the microphone. What happened next wasn't dramatic in the way people expected. It was quiet, precise. She began by stating who she was and what she had done, not what she felt, not what she believed, but what she had contributed over the years. Then she did something that changed everything. She showed proof. One by one, she presented messages, reports, and documents. Not all details, not anything that would harm the children, but enough to reveal the truth clearly. The police report showing the children had been left without her consent, the forms listing her as a caregiver without authorization, the hospital incident confirming the attempt to leave children at her workplace. Each piece was simple on its own. Together they formed a pattern that could not be ignored. The room grew quiet, not the polite silence from before, but a different kind. The kind that comes when assumptions begin to break. People looked at each other, then back at the screen, then at Camille. Because now the story didn't rely on emotion, it relied on evidence. When someone in the crowd finally spoke up questioning the narrative they had been told, the shift became undeniable. Doubt replaced certainty. Sympathy turned into hesitation, and the fundraiser itself, built on a version of truth, began to collapse under the weight of reality. Camille didn't insult her family. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to, because truth, when shown clearly, doesn't need volume. It needs visibility. And in that moment, everything changed. Not because she fought harder, but because she stopped fighting and started showing. After the fundraiser, the shift wasn't loud. It was steady, quiet, and impossible to reverse. Camille didn't need to say anything else. She didn't need to defend herself again. The truth had already been placed where everyone could see it, and once people saw clearly, they couldn't unsee it. What followed wasn't immediate collapse, but a slow unraveling. Trevor felt it first. The video he had posted, the one he believed would turn people against Camille, began to work against him instead. Viewers started asking questions. Small ones at first about context, about what happened before the clip began. Then bigger ones, about why he was filming instead of helping, why the children were there in the first place. And when pieces of the full story began to circulate, the narrative he had tried to control slipped out of his hands. His workplace noticed too. The hospital incident wasn't just a personal matter. It involved behavior in a professional environment, captured on cameras, connected to his name. He wasn't immediately dismissed, but the trust around him changed. Conversations became formal. Oversight increased. And eventually, the weight of repeated poor judgment became too heavy to ignore. His position, once stable, began to fade. Marissa's world shifted differently, but just as deeply. The online space she had built, carefully curated images, supportive messages, a community that believed in her story, began to fracture. Followers who once offered unconditional support started hesitating. Questions replaced encouragement. Doubt replaced certainty. Some stayed silent. Others quietly stepped away. And a few spoke openly, pointing out inconsistencies that could no longer be explained away. It wasn't a dramatic fall. It was a gradual loss of credibility, the kind that doesn't make noise, but changes everything. Camille's parents experienced it in their own way. For years, they had relied on reputation, on being seen as respectable, dependable, in control. But now that image had cracks. People didn't confront them directly, but the tone shifted. Conversations became shorter. Invitations became less frequent. The unspoken respect they once held no longer came automatically, and perhaps for the first time they were left to face the consequences of decisions they had never questioned before. But the most immediate change was also the simplest. They had to take care of the children themselves. No automatic support. No unspoken backup. No quiet assumption that Camille would step in when things became difficult. Responsibilities that had once been passed to her now stayed where they belonged. Schedules had to be rearranged. Energy had to be managed. Reality had to be faced without escape. Camille watched it all from a distance, not with satisfaction, not with revenge, but with clarity. She hadn't caused any of this. She had simply stopped absorbing it. And sometimes, the moment you stop carrying what was never yours, everything else finally has to fall into place on its own. By the time mediation was scheduled, Camille wasn't walking in to argue, she was walking in to close the door. The room felt different from every confrontation before. There were no raised voices, no dramatic entrances, no attempts to control the narrative with emotion. Just a table, two sides, and something her family had never truly faced before: structure. Camille sat beside Maya, steady and composed, while across from her were the same people who had once dictated her role without question. But this time they weren't in control of the setting. The rules were clear, the process defined, and every word carried weight. When the discussion began, her family tried to fall back into familiar patterns. Trevor attempted to minimize what had happened, suggesting misunderstandings, downplaying actions that had already been documented. Marissa leaned into emotion, speaking about stress, about assumptions, about how she believed Camille would help, because she always had. Their parents said little, but their presence carried the same quiet expectation that things could somehow return to normal. But nothing about this situation was normal anymore. Maya responded not with emotion, but with clarity. Every claim was met with documentation. Every assumption was answered with fact. Past behavior was acknowledged but not accepted as future obligation. And slowly the conversation shifted from denial to recognition. Not necessarily acceptance in an emotional sense, but acknowledgement in a legal one. Because in that room, belief didn't matter. Agreement did. The outcome was detailed, precise, and final. Boundaries were no longer implied, they were written. No direct contact outside of controlled communication. No use of Camille's name in any child-related documents. No attempts to leave children in her care without explicit consent. Financial responsibility for the legal process and consequences, tied directly to previous actions. It wasn't punishment. It was accountability. And that difference mattered. As each term was reviewed, signed, and confirmed, the weight of the situation became real in a way it never had before. Not through argument, not through conflict, but through permanence. Camille didn't feel victorious in the way people might expect. There was no sense of triumph, no moment of satisfaction. What she felt instead was something quieter, but far more powerful: release. For the first time, her life wasn't tied to expectations she never agreed to. Her role wasn't being negotiated. It was being defined by her and protected by something stronger than words. As the meeting ended, her sister looked at her and said she had changed. Camille didn't argue, because she knew the truth. She hadn't changed into someone new. She had simply stopped being someone others could control. The night before Camille moved to a new city, her apartment was half empty, filled with boxes labeled with pieces of a life she had finally reclaimed. There was no chaos, no last-minute crisis, no urgent calls demanding her attention, just quiet. A kind of quiet that once would have made her uneasy, but now felt earned. When her phone rang from an unfamiliar number, she hesitated for a moment before answering. Her mother's voice came through softer than she had ever heard it, carrying something unfamiliar: uncertainty. She asked if Camille was really going to leave over what she called a few babysitting problems. Camille looked around her space at the absence of pressure, the absence of expectation, and understood something deeply. It had never been about babysitting. It had been about control, about identity, about a life slowly shaped by demands she had never agreed to. And for the first time, she said it clearly. She wasn't leaving because of one situation. She was leaving because she had finally seen the pattern. When she arrived in her new city, everything felt different. Not easier, not perfect, but honest. The challenges she faced were hers, chosen and understood, not assigned or forced. She built a routine that didn't revolve around being available for others. She learned what it meant to wake up without anticipating someone else's needs. At first, the silence still felt strange, like something was missing. But over time, she realized it wasn't absence, it was peace. Months passed, and her life began to take shape in ways she had never allowed before. She made connections, built friendships, and rediscovered parts of herself that had been buried under obligation. She still cared about her nieces and nephew, and that never changed. But the way she cared changed completely. Support no longer meant sacrifice. Love no longer meant losing herself. She helped in ways that were clear, defined, and within her control. And most importantly, she didn't step back into a role that had once consumed her. Back home, her family adjusted in their own way. Without Camille as the invisible support system, they were forced to face reality. Responsibilities couldn't be shifted. Plans couldn't rely on assumption. Life demanded effort from the people who created those responsibilities in the first place. And while that adjustment wasn't easy, it was necessary. Because growth rarely comes from comfort, it comes from accountability. One day, months later, her mother called again. This time there was no accusation, no pressure, just something closer to understanding. She admitted she hadn't realized how much Camille had been carrying. Camille listened not with anger, not with the need to prove anything, but with distance and clarity. She didn't rush to fix things. She didn't return to what had been. Because healing doesn't mean going back. It means moving forward differently. That night, Camille sat by her window as rain fell softly outside her phone, silent beside her. For the first time, that silence didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like freedom. She thought about everything that had happened, the expectations, the pressure, the breaking point, and the boundaries that followed. And she understood the lesson fully. You can love people and still refuse to be used by them. You can care deeply and still say no. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for yourself is walk away from a life that was never truly yours.